They didn't forget her name. They just hoped no one would say it out loud. After years of silence, a decorated female general returns to her small hometown for her brother's military ceremony, only to face the same quiet erasure that forced her into exile. But when a single unexpected gesture turns the spotlight back on her legacy, the room begins to remember who she truly is. In this powerful story of dignity, buried truth, and long overdue recognition, what happens when the truth stands up and demands to be seen? Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story may just change how you see your own family. Rebecca Sievers never flinched when a door slammed or when the sharp clap of boots echoed down narrow hallways. But the sound of her own last name, spoken like a question, like a rumor, still made something tighten in her chest. She hadn't heard it said aloud in this town in 5 years. Not like that. Not with curiosity, confusion, or contempt. It had come from the hostess. Young, bright smile, clipboard in hand, too polite to let her eyes linger on the ribbons and bars stitched above Rebecca's left breast. "Sievers?" she'd asked again, scanning the reservation list. "Here for the Lawson party?" Rebecca nodded once. That's right. The girl's smile didn't falter, but the moment stretched too long, as if she expected Rebecca to explain why her face didn't match the family's. Or maybe why she looked like someone who should be in charge of the party, not awkwardly trailing behind it. Finally, the hostess turned and gestured with a hand. "They are already seated. Right this way." Rebecca followed her through the dining room, the steady clink of silverware and the hum of celebratory chatter building in her ears. The room smelled of filet mignon and wine and money. Her shoes clicked softly against polished hardwood, each step practiced, measured. Muscle memory from war zones and briefings and tribunal rooms. Not suburban steakhouse carpet. The table came into view. Long linen draped, glittering with glassware. Her brother James sat near the center, uniform pressed crisp, his new oak leaves catching the light as he laughed with someone from the base. Their parents flanked him like sentries. Marilyn Sievers, all silk and pearls, eyes already half glazed from her second glass of Chardonnay, and Frank Sievers, her father. Rigid-backed press shirt, marine-issue scowl, his glass of whiskey sat untouched, but no less imposing. Rebecca watched as her arrival registered, one face at a time. Her mother glanced up, paused, and smiled a tight, rehearsed smile before quickly looking away. Her brother's smile faltered, not out of malice, but discomfort. The same look he gave during childhood when she was scolded and he was told to sit quietly and watch how not to behave. Her father didn't even blink. The hostess gestured to the empty chair at the end of the table. "Thanks," Rebecca murmured. No one said a word when she sat. Forks kept moving, glasses kept lifting. The only thing that stopped was the moment in her own chest, like she'd exhaled too hard and the breath wouldn't return. Conversation flowed again. Someone teased James about promotion perks. Someone else joked about his new parking spot. Her mother gushed about the photographer she'd hired for James's formal portraits. James himself gave a half-hearted protest about the fuss, but it was clear he loved every second of it. Rebecca didn't reach for her menu. She already knew the meal had been pre-ordered. It was steak for everyone, the same order their father had made for special occasions since she was a child. No one had asked if she still ate red meat. She folded her hands in her lap, the black fabric of her dress jacket straining slightly at the shoulders. It had been tailored for her last deployment. She didn't bother updating it since. James finally glanced toward her, offering a quick half-smile across the length of the table. "Glad you could make it," he said, as if she'd RSVP'd late, as if the seat hadn't been a reluctant add-on. Rebecca nodded. "Wouldn't miss it." Someone at the table laughed, probably at another joke she hadn't heard, and the attention shifted again. She was forgotten within seconds. The waiter arrived with wine, poured for everyone except her. Rebecca raised a hand politely. "Just water, thanks." "Of course, ma'am," the waiter said, before hesitating just slightly on ma'am, and glancing at the bars on her chest. He walked off quickly. Her water arrived with the starters, a salad she hadn't ordered and wouldn't eat. Rebecca stared at it, then folded her napkin neatly across her lap. She could feel the conversation beginning to swell again, louder, warmer now that the alcohol was setting in. Then came the toast. Her father stood, glass raised in a stiff, practiced motion. "Let's not drag this out," he said. "This is a night to celebrate a real accomplishment." Rebecca felt it before he said it. She always did. The way he squared his jaw, the calculated pause. "Here's to Major James Lawson," he said, loud enough for the tables around them to hear. "To those who serve with honor." A pause. "And those who just serve their egos." The table laughed. Not heartily, nervously, as if they'd been waiting for the punchline and hoped they'd understood it right. James chuckled, uncertain, and reached for his wine. Rebecca didn't move. Her hands remained folded in her lap. Her throat tightened, not from tears, but restraint. This wasn't new. The public performance of shame, the familiar script. She knew her lines: say nothing, look polite, swallow hard, and disappear. Her mother took a sip of her drink without looking up. One of James's friends coughed awkwardly. Aunt Diane murmured something about how Rebecca always was dramatic. Rebecca sat straighter. Frank remained standing for a second longer, soaking in the discomfort like a man who believed it proved something. Then he sat. James turned to her, his smile faintly apologetic. "Dad's just, you know how he is." Rebecca said nothing. How he is? As if that was new? As if he hadn't been how he is since she was 8 and beat a neighborhood boy in a foot race and was punished for embarrassing him? As if he hadn't been how he is when she graduated West Point and he refused to attend because he wasn't about to clap for some diversity program? Rebecca sipped her water. The steak came next, pink and bleeding and expensive. James made a joke about the portion size. Her mother talked about how hard James had worked, how proud she was, how he always knew his path. No one asked what Rebecca had been doing since she left active duty. No one asked about the things she'd commanded, the losses she'd carried, the ribbons she never wore in public anymore. She chewed a piece of bread slowly. It tasted like dust. It wasn't until dessert arrived, chocolate torte with piped icing reading, "Congratulations, Major Lawson," that her silence became conspicuous. James glanced down the table again. "Beck, you sure you're okay?" The name hit like a rock skipping over a still pond. "Fine," she said, voice even. "Just not very hungry." Her father scoffed audibly. "Never been a fan of earned meals, that one." Another ripple of laughter. That was when the door opened. Not slammed, not dramatic, just opened, clean and slow. The kind of entrance only a certain type of man made. Calm, sure of his welcome, but not dependent on it. A tall figure stepped into the room. Dress blues, medals across the chest like a story whispered in shorthand. Silver hair, jaw like carved stone. Rebecca didn't have to turn. She knew who it was before the room even stilled. Colonel Dean Mercer scanned the restaurant. His eyes swept past the families, the uniforms, the laughter. And then they stopped on her. He walked forward with purpose. He didn't nod to the retired Marine at the head of the table, didn't shake James's hand. He moved past the steak and the torte and the smiles, frozen halfway. He stopped before Rebecca, and then he saluted. "General Sievers," he said, voice clear, firm, proud. "Ma'am, welcome back." The restaurant froze, forks mid-air. Wine paused in glass. James's face drained of color. Frank Sievers' hand trembled just enough for a drop of whiskey to spill, and Rebecca, still silent, steady, slowly rose to her feet. She returned the salute. Quiet, unshaken. The air in the room changed. And for the first time in 5 years, Rebecca Sievers was seen. It didn't take long for the noise to return. Forks picked up where they'd left off. Glasses clinked. Nervous chuckles bloomed into full, uneasy laughter, like the moment hadn't happened at all. Like a decorated colonel hadn't just walked through the front doors of a suburban steakhouse and saluted a woman her own family had spent years pretending was invisible. Colonel Mercer didn't stay. He didn't linger for pleasantries or ask for a seat. He simply gave his salute, held her gaze like it mattered, then offered a quiet, "Good to see you again, ma'am," and turned on his heel. His exit was as sharp and unceremonious as his arrival, but the air didn't return to normal. Not really. Not for Rebecca. Not for the people sitting around that long white linen table, who now had to reckon with a version of her they'd refused to acknowledge. Frank Sievers cleared his throat first, muttering something to no one in particular as he pushed his half-finished dessert away. His face had gone a shade paler, jaw tight, the thick ridge of his scar from an old shrapnel wound pressing white under his skin. He wouldn't look at her. Not directly. James was the first to break the silence with any real words. "That was unexpected," he said lightly, as if he were trying to talk about the weather or a surprise item on the menu. "You, know Colonel Mercer?" Rebecca's hands were back in her lap, fingers lightly pressed together, but her spine had gone ramrod straight. "Served under him in Germany," she replied. He was one of the few who didn't forget what loyalty meant when the headlines moved on. James gave a small nod, but his eyes had flicked down to the table, avoiding the tremor that had just passed through the group. "Well," he said, offering a tight smile. "Small world." Marilyn Sievers smiled too, but not at Rebecca. Her gaze remained trained on the perfectly rounded scoop of whipped cream beside her son's slice of cake. "It's so sweet of Dean to drop in," she said in that soft, drawling tone she used when avoiding discomfort. "Must have been passing through. I imagine it wasn't by accident," Rebecca replied, her voice even. "The man reads people better than anyone I've ever known." Aunt Diane cleared her throat in that way she always did before she decided to pretend the room wasn't on fire. "Well," she said, pulling her napkin off her lap and folding it with precision, "we certainly had our moment of excitement, didn't we? Now, James, tell us again about your next station. You said it's near, what, Dayton? Ohio, yeah," James said quickly, clearly grateful for the redirect. "I'll be at Wright-Patterson. Joint op stuff mostly. It's a good step, better than sitting around waiting on a promotion," Frank muttered under his breath. Rebecca heard it. So did Marilyn. No one commented. She wanted to say something sharp, something honest, something that would cut through the pretense like Mercer's salute had just done. But she'd been trained to pick her battles, and this wasn't a battlefield where clarity won. This was the kind of room where truth sounded like aggression and silence was called grace, though she said nothing. Instead, she looked around the table, at the people who had known her since she was a child, who had once lined the driveway waving flags when she left for West Point, who had filled the church pews for her commissioning ceremony, and now they couldn't even say her title. Couldn't call her what she was, not general, not even soldier, just someone to tolerate. James spoke again, answering a question about logistics and base housing, and Rebecca could tell from the way he leaned forward that he was trying. He wasn't cruel, not really, just spineless where it counted. He loved her in that distant, foggy kind of way that made him think birthday texts were enough and silence during the hard years was staying out of it. Marilyn offered James more wine, pouring with the delicacy of a hostess who'd spent her life pretending she didn't know what discomfort looked like. "I hope you'll get a nice apartment," she said. "Something spacious, maybe with those granite countertops. You always did like modern things." "Still do," James said, chuckling. Rebecca took another sip of water. The glass was sweating in her hand, tiny droplets running down like it was nervous for her. She wondered if anyone else noticed how warm the room had become. The air felt heavy, like the ceiling had sunk just a little lower since Mercer's salute. Diane started talking about a cruise she and her husband were taking. Something about the Mediterranean, or maybe Alaska. Rebecca didn't really care. The table livened again. The tension softened, like a bruise being rubbed too hard, so the sting turned into numbness. But she saw it. The side glances, the slight downturn of Frank's mouth, the flicker in Marilyn's eyes. They were recalibrating. They had built a version of her absence that made sense. And now Mercer had knocked it over with 3 words. "General Sievers, ma'am, welcome back." Rebecca placed her napkin beside her untouched plate and leaned back slightly. The sounds of the restaurant pushed in around her again. Waiters shifting trays, a baby fussing in a booth nearby, glasses clinking, forks cutting meat. She stood, not abruptly, not rudely, just enough to command quiet. James looked up first. Then Marilyn. Then Diane. "Thank you for dinner," Rebecca said, her voice calm and unshaken. "It's clear this night means a lot to you." "You're leaving?" Marilyn asked, startled. "It's late," Rebecca replied, "and I think we've all said what needed saying." Frank muttered something inaudible, but she didn't ask him to repeat it. James stood as well, more out of habit than solidarity. "Beck? Wait a minute." She paused. "You didn't have to come, you know," he said. "But I appreciate it." Rebecca looked at him. Really looked. "James," she said. I didn't come for you. I came because I needed to remind myself that I still exist. That I was never the story they told in rooms like this." He looked confused, but he didn't challenge her. He just nodded, swallowed, and stepped back. She gave Marilyn a small smile. Not cruel, not forgiving, just a farewell. Then she turned and walked out, head high, back straight, the way she had walked off a dozen airfields in half a dozen countries. She didn't look back, not even when the door clicked closed behind her. Frank Sievers was up before the sun the next morning, like always. Routine was a kind of religion for men like him. Shave before the mirror fogs, eggs at 6, coffee black, and lawn chairs in the shed by 7:30. The backyard still held the mist from the early hours, softening the sharp corners of the old tool shed and casting dew across the faded wooden fence. Frank stood at the kitchen sink, arms crossed over his chest, watching the condensation trickle down the window. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Marilyn had already learned how to read silence better than words. She set his coffee down on the counter behind him and turned without expecting a thank you. "You should talk to her," she said gently as she rinsed a glass. "She didn't come all this way just to sit in silence." Frank didn't answer, just sipped his coffee, bitter and burning, and stared out at the lawn like the ghosts of old units were lined up in formation across the grass. "She's staying at the lodge on Main," Marilyn continued, "the one next to the old hardware store, probably leaving soon. You know Rebecca? And that name again. Soft, cautious, like it might trigger a landmine." "She walked out," Frank finally muttered, not taking his eyes off the yard. "That's all I remember." "She came back," Marilyn said. "That's all I care about." Up the road, Rebecca sat in her rental car in front of the county library, parked beneath the shade of a towering oak. The building hadn't changed in 20 years. Same chipped white columns, same cracked steps, same crooked wooden bench on the porch where she used to read about ancient wars in oversized history books. There was comfort in the stillness of it. Unlike people, buildings never pretended not to remember you. She hadn't slept much. The hotel bed felt too soft, the sheets too clean. She was used to sleeping light anyway, half-rested, half-ready, even now. There were old habits that hadn't let go, long after the uniforms were folded into boxes and the gear was sent back to depot storage. Her phone vibrated on the passenger seat, a number with no name. Rebecca let it buzz until it stopped. It was probably James, or maybe one of the dinner guests trying to soothe their conscience with a polite message and a promise to catch up soon. She didn't want polite. She wanted truth, and no one in that room had offered it except for the man who had walked in uninvited and reminded them all who she was, Colonel Dean Mercer. She hadn't seen him in person since the debrief in Stuttgart, the day after the explosion that killed 3 soldiers under her command and put her in a hospital bed for weeks. Everyone else had stopped calling, but Mercer came. He didn't say much. He just stood at the foot of her bed and said one thing. You made the right call, even if they won't admit it. And now, years later, he'd said more in 5 words than her family had in 5 years. Rebecca's fingers hovered over her phone, debating. She didn't have to call him. He hadn't asked her to. He'd done his part. He'd made the point. But something in her, a knot she hadn't quite untied since last night, needed closure. Or maybe just clarity. She called. He answered on the second ring. Sievers? His voice came through, deep and familiar, like gravel under boots. Didn't think I'd hear from you so soon. Didn't think I'd need to, she said. A pause. Fair. You planned that, didn't you? She asked. Walking in like that. The salute. Another pause. But she could hear the smile in his voice this time. Figured you could use some help reminding them who the hell you are.
Rebecca looked out at the town square where a couple of kids were riding bikes across cracked pavement, their laughter echoing off the post office walls. You know what they think happened, she said. They think I left because I broke, or failed, or got soft.
I know. Henry rewrote my story. They tried, Mercer said. But they didn't succeed. Not with anyone who matters. She didn't answer right away. I'm going to the potluck today, she said finally. He laughed softly. God help you. I need to see it for myself. The wall. The pictures. I want to see how far the story went.
Then go, he said. But you don't need to prove anything to them, Sievers. You've already done what they couldn't. She wanted to believe that. Some part of her did. But there were still splinters under her skin, pieces of the girl who once waited for her father's approval like it was oxygen. You don't strip that out in one night, even with a salute that shook the room. She hung up and drove toward the Sievers house. The backyard looked the same. Frank's obsession with the lawn had kept it neat, sharp-edged, like a green carpet rolled out for people he barely tolerated. There were folding chairs set up in rows, paper tablecloths billowing gently in the breeze, plastic trays of pasta salad and deviled eggs baking under the late morning sun. Flags had been planted along the perimeter, small and faded but still proud. James was already there, surrounded by neighbors, his posture perfect, his uniform gleaming. Marilyn moved between tables like a hostess at a church function, balancing a plastic pitcher of iced tea in one hand and a Tupperware lid in the other. Rebecca stepped through the side gate and felt every pair of eyes shift toward her. No one said anything. Not at first. Just a ripple, like the kind that spreads when a dog walks into a room full of cats. Nobody sure whether to greet or growl. She walked past the tables, past the men in baseball caps marked with unit crests and embroidered years, past the women who blinked too much and smiled too tightly. She headed straight for the photo display by the fence. There it was, just like she remembered from before. Her father in Vietnam, her grandfather in World War II, James in his basic training portrait, grinning like he didn't yet know what it meant to be sent somewhere you didn't choose, but her photo wasn't there. Not the one from West Point, not the one from her promotion to full bird colonel, not the one from Afghanistan, standing with her team after a successful extraction. Dirt on her face, sun in her eyes, and pride in her blood. Diane stepped up beside her with a paper plate in one hand and a saccharine smile. Guess they ran out of room, huh? She said, almost laughing. Rebecca didn't answer. She didn't need to, because behind her she heard it again, softer this time, but no less firm. General Sievers, she turned. Was it Mercer? It was Ronnie Hartwell, her father's old friend, a Marine from the Gulf War with a limp and a voice like sandpaper. He wasn't saluting, just standing, one hand over his heart. It's good to see you again, he said. We've missed having real leadership around here. And this time, when Rebecca looked back at the table, she saw one of the younger veterans, barely 30, rise from his chair, and then another. No one said a word. They just stood. Frank Sievers sat frozen on his folding chair, watching the men stand for the daughter he'd tried to forget. Rebecca nodded once, and for the first time since coming home, she allowed herself to feel not revenge, not validation, just peace. The hospital room had smelt like bleach and regret. Rebecca remembered the hard fluorescent light above her bed, the stiff, starchy sheets, and the throb in her shoulder that reminded her she was still alive. The blast had torn through the lead vehicle of the convoy like paper. 3 men gone instantly. 2 more critically wounded. She hadn't been in the Humvee when it hit, She'd stepped out 30 seconds before to check the route ahead. Luck, they said. Pure dumb luck. But it hadn't felt like luck when she'd stood there, uniform covered in dust and blood, barking orders with hands that trembled only after the medevac had lifted off. In the weeks that followed, the investigation came down like rain, quiet, bureaucratic, and full of forms. There were questions about her leadership, about protocol, about whether she'd made the right call, splitting the convoy's timing to avoid satellite surveillance. Command never said it outright, but the undertone was clear. Someone needed to answer for the dead. She did. Not in court, not officially, just in silence. They offered her a clean exit. Honorable, decorated, tactful. The kind that sounded like a choice but felt like a corner. She took it. The medal arrived by mail 2 months later, folded in blue velvet, with a pre-written letter of appreciation from a man who hadn't been there. She'd held it once, then packed it away. The memory sat heavy in her now as she leaned against the wooden post at the edge of the Sievers' backyard. The afternoon sun glared off the top of Frank's old grill, where someone was burning hot dogs and talking too loud about the last baseball season. The smell of overcooked meat and lawn fertilizer mixed into the air like some grotesque version of Americana. Ronnie Hartwell had rejoined the folding table, sipping from a red plastic cup, fielding questions from a younger vet who couldn't stop glancing at Rebecca like she was a headline brought to life. Her name, her rank. It was spreading again, soft as a rumor, but finally in the right direction. It didn't make the air easier to breathe, but it no longer suffocated. She turned when she heard the creak of the screen door behind her. James stepped out, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. He didn't look at her right away, just ran a hand through his hair and stared out at the backyard like he wasn't sure whether to join the living or crawl back into the house. "They're asking about you," he said finally. Rebecca didn't move. "What did you tell them? You're home for a bit, taking time. That's what you said, right?" She smiled without humor. "It's what I let people say." James rocked on his heels for a moment. "Ronnie knew your story, all of it. He told me after you left last night. Said the army tried to hang you out to dry for a decision command made 3 days before you ever got boots on the ground. They needed someone," Rebecca said simply, "and I was the one standing." He looked at her then, really looked. "I should have asked," he said. "Back then, when you stopped coming around." Rebecca turned to him slowly. Her eyes were calm, but her voice was edged like a dull blade, more wound than weapon. "You had my number. Silence was your choice." James didn't flinch. He just nodded once, like the blow had landed exactly where it needed to. "Dad said you couldn't handle it, said you cracked under pressure." She laughed, then quietly, bitterly. "Frank Sievers never believed a woman could lead men, let alone walk away from a fight with her dignity intact. Me leaving the army just proved him right in his own head." "You know that's not true." James rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't come here to defend him. I came because I want to understand." Rebecca let that sit in the air for a moment. "You don't need to understand," she said. "You need to decide if you believe the version of me that shows up when I speak, or the one they painted when I went quiet." James sighed. "Why didn't you fight it? The discharge, the blame?" "I did," she said, "behind closed doors, but you don't fight command on the record unless you want your next battle fought in courtrooms and headlines. Mercer advised me to walk before they could twist the facts beyond repair. And so you let them erase you." Rebecca looked down at the grass, at the faint lines the lawnmower had left earlier that morning. "I let them survive their shame by burying mine." He didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The breeze stirred the corner of the photo board again, tugging at the edges. Rebecca looked over, and for a moment, she imagined her picture was there, right between her father's and James. The same proud eyes, the same square jaw, the same uniform, though hers carried the weight of battle, not just the promise of it. James followed her gaze. "I'll print one," he said, "of you. From West Point, or somewhere better, you pick it." Rebecca arched an eyebrow. "I don't need a picture on a poster board to matter, James." "I know," he said, "but maybe Dad does." She didn't reply, but she didn't argue either. The rest of the afternoon slipped by in fragments. Overheard conversations, a brief thanks from a woman in a Coast Guard hoodie, a shy boy who said he wanted to be a general like her when he grew up. Rebecca shook his hand gently, told him that strength came in knowing when not to fight too. As the sun began to dip, the folding tables emptied. Guests filtered out, balancing leftover containers and paper flags. The yard thinned. Rebecca stayed by the fence, eyes scanning the familiar outline of a house that had never quite felt like home. And then she saw him. He stepped out from the back porch like a statue come alive. No cap, no cigar, just his jaw locked in place, and the same look he'd worn since she was 13 and had outscored him on a rifle range. They stood in silence for a long moment. He approached, hands in the pockets of his pressed khakis. "I told them not to put your picture up," he said, voice flat. Rebecca blinked once, no surprise. "I thought it'd be easier that way," he added. "For you, maybe," she said, "but not for me." Frank looked down at the dirt. A pair of old service boots, too polished for comfort. "You shouldn't have taken the fall for that mess overseas. I was the only one who could afford to." "I read the report," he muttered. "Later, after, and you were right," he said. It was quiet, barely louder than the rustle of the breeze, but it reached her. She didn't move. Frank glanced back toward the fence, then up at the board. "You got a photo? Does it matter?" He hesitated. "Bring one next year, I'll hang it myself." But she exhaled. "Not forgiveness, not yet. But release." Frank cleared his throat. "Dinner's inside if you want. I'll think about it," she said. He gave a nod, half a step back, then walked away. And for the first time, Rebecca didn't feel like she was leaving a battlefield. She felt like she was walking off one.
The invitation had come days earlier in the form of a group text Rebecca had nearly deleted. A Veterans Day potluck. Same backyard as always. Bring a dish if you feel like it. Chairs will be set up near the fence. James had included her on the list, probably out of guilt, maybe hope. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her silence, like always, was enough for people to interpret however suited them best. She still showed up. Rebecca arrived with a store-bought apple pie, the sticker peeled off, and the top dusted with cinnamon to pass for homemade. She wasn't trying to fool anyone. It just felt better than showing up empty-handed. The driveway was already full, so she parked on the street 2 houses down and walked in with the pie balanced on one hand and her other tucked in the pocket of a windbreaker. She didn't wear her uniform, not this time. Today wasn't for salutes or silver eagles, it was for blending in. Though she knew by now, she never really could. She stepped into the yard and was greeted by the sound of folding chairs creaking, plastic utensils scraping paper plates, and the low murmur of neighbors swapping old stories like coins. The grill was working overtime in the far corner, manned by a retired Navy chief who barked orders to nobody in particular while flipping bratwursts with mechanical precision. Above the tables, a tangled string of patriotic bunting drooped between 2 poles, faded from years of weather but still trying to look proud. James caught sight of her first. He gave a wave. Not too big, not too small. Just enough to signal he noticed, without drawing attention. That was his way. Always measured. Always afraid of tipping the scales. Rebecca made her way to the serving table, slipped the pie between 2 crock pots of chili, and looked around for a seat. That's when she noticed. The name cards, they weren't fancy. Just index cards, folded tenthal, handwritten in blue marker. But they were deliberate. Capped. Daniels, SSGT, Murphy, LT Cole, Hill. A table reserved for the uniforms, the ranks, the people worth celebrating. Her name wasn't among them. Not even her first name scribbled at a corner seat as an afterthought. There were plenty of chairs, just none for her. Aunt Diane was the one who noticed her hesitation. She appeared beside Rebecca like a shadow, armed with a diet soda and the same artificial smile she wore to funerals and fundraisers. "Oh, sweetheart," Diane said with syrupy sympathy. "Those seats are mostly for the boys in current service or folks Dad served with. You know how he is about that." Rebecca didn't answer. Diane gestured toward the far end of the yard, where a weathered card table leaned against the fence next to the water cooler and a pile of mismatched chairs. "Would you mind sliding over there? That spot's reserved for Lieutenant Hayes." Diane continued, completely unaware she'd just told a decorated general to make room for a junior officer. Rebecca nodded. Of course. She carried a paper plate and cup of iced tea to the auxiliary table, sat down beside a tray of grocery store potato salad, and took in the view. From here the entire yard unfolded in perfect symmetry. Old men with stooped backs and ball caps that bore unit numbers. Young families trying to keep toddlers from knocking over juice boxes. Neighbors she hadn't seen in years smiling like they knew her, even though they never asked why she disappeared. Against the back fence was the photo display. Same layout as always. 3 folding boards covered in snapshots, medals, and yellowed newspaper clippings. Her grandfather in black and white, smiling in front of a tank in France. Her father in jungle greens, helmet tilted back, rifle slung casually across his chest. James at basic training, mid-salute, his grin stretching just a little too wide. Rebecca waited for her photo to appear. It did not the one from West Point. Not the one from her Bronze Star ceremony. Not the one with her squad in Kandahar, dirt-streaked and sunburnt but alive. She didn't ask why. She didn't have to. To them, she was still the question mark in the family's history. A chapter without a headline. A record that ended mid-page. She leaned back in her chair, sipped her tea, and watched as her father stood near the grill, telling a story to 2 men who nodded like he was a preacher. She couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the rhythm, sharp, controlled, peppered with just enough self-deprecation to sound modest. Frank Sievers had always known how to command a room. He just never let his daughter inherit the space. One of the old-timers approached the photo wall, humming to himself. He paused at a picture of Frank and tapped the corner with his knuckle. Back in the day, he muttered, shaking his head. Hell of a time. Then he moved down the row, stopped again, his brow furrowed. Where's the girl? He asked aloud to no one in particular. What's her name? The one that went to the point. Thought she made rank. A silence followed. Brief, but sharp. Rebecca set her tea down. She's here, someone else said. Think she's around somewhere. The man turned and looked out over the crowd. His eyes landed on her. Rebecca met his gaze and gave a small nod. The man blinked. Then something in his posture changed. He stepped away from the board and started toward her table, slowly at first, then more deliberately. When he reached her, he didn't sit. He didn't smile. He simply said, General. It wasn't a question. Rebecca stood. He extended his hand. Name's Hal. Served with your dad in Nam. Heard about you from Ronnie. Said you held a unit together when the brass gave you nothing but chaos. She shook his hand. I tried. You did more than that, Hal said. You did what most of us wouldn't have had the spine for. The conversation caught attention. A few heads turned. Ronnie was already making his way over, walking slow, cane tapping the grass with every step. Hal gestured toward the photo wall. That board's missing something. Ronnie nodded. Yeah, it's missing her. From across the yard, Frank watched. He didn't move, but his jaw tightened. One of the younger vets, a kid no older than 25, stepped forward. I didn't know, he said. I didn't know we had someone like you here. Rebecca's voice was steady. I'm not the story they told. And just like that, the tide shifted. Not loud, not theatrical, just a quiet rearranging of the room. One by one, a few more vets stood and drifted toward her side of the yard. Not to gawk, not to perform, just to stand in proximity, to acknowledge, to say. For the first time that day, Rebecca didn't feel like a shadow on the edge of a celebration. She felt like part of the truth they'd been afraid to admit, and the seat next to her, the one that had been empty all afternoon, was finally filled. The sun was beginning to drop behind the maple trees, casting long shadows over the yard and cooling the thick, humid air into something more bearable. Plates clattered into the trash bags tied to fence posts. Laughter dimmed into low conversation, and the scent of charcoal and overcooked meat slowly gave way to that dry, dusty scent of fallen leaves and scorched grass. Most of the guests had drifted toward their cars or lingered at the edges of the yard with half-finished cups in hand. Rebecca Sievers stayed seated. She hadn't moved much since the quiet moment that had shifted everything. Since Hal and Ronnie and a small circle of veterans had stood by her side and filled the silence her own family wouldn't break. They didn't make speeches. They didn't salute. They simply existed beside her, which, for a woman who had spent years being erased in her own bloodline, felt like more than enough. She was still in that metal folding chair by the fence, one boot resting on the rung beneath it, fingers idly curling and uncurling around a paper cup of lukewarm iced tea. Her eyes followed her father as he moved across the yard, slow now, not from age but from weight, like he knew the ground had shifted under him and wasn't sure yet if it would hold. Frank Sievers walked straight past her, straight past the folding chairs, past the cooler and the worn photo board. He didn't say anything, but she saw his jaw move slightly, like he was chewing on the words and couldn't bring himself to spit them out. She didn't rise, didn't call after him. That wasn't her job anymore. Marilyn approached a few minutes later, arms folded across her midsection, like she was shielding herself from something unseen. Her heels sunk softly into the grass. She glanced at the now thinned crowd, then sat down beside Rebecca without asking permission. "He's not good at being wrong," she said, almost a whisper. "Never has been." Rebecca didn't look at her, just kept her gaze fixed on the fence, where a faded flag hung limp in the still air. "I noticed. I think he thought if he ignored it long enough it would go away." "Eight?" Rebecca asked. "You mean me?" Marilyn winced. "That's not what I meant, but it's what you said." Marilyn let the silence stretch between them. She wasn't a cruel woman, just one who'd spent her whole life in quiet rooms, nodding along with things she didn't believe, because it made the shouting stop faster. "You were always different," she finally said. Frank didn't know what to do with that. "He didn't have to do anything," Rebecca replied. "He just had to not destroy it." "I should have said something," Marilyn murmured. Rebecca turned her head slowly. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "We might divert her." Marilyn's lips pressed together. No defense, no deflection. Just truth, hanging there in the cooling air. "I'm not asking for an apology," Rebecca added. "I'm asking for acknowledgement. That what you let happen wasn't right, that the silence wasn't neutral." "I see you now," Marilyn said, and there was something in her voice that cracked at the edges. "Not the rank, not the uniform, just you. The daughter I let slip away." Rebecca looked down at the dirt. "I've been standing in the same place for 10 years. You all just chose to walk in a different direction." They sat there a while longer, neither reaching out, neither flinching. Just two women bound by blood and distance, quietly recognizing that grief takes many forms, some of them invisible. A car door slammed somewhere out front. A child laughed, high and clear, across the street. Then Ronnie Hartwell's voice cut through the hush, loud enough to catch attention but low enough to hold dignity. "Hey, Frank," he called. "Got a second?" Frank had returned to the edge of the porch, hands on the railing, staring out like a man hoping to fade into the dark. He turned, slowly, squinting into the yard. Ronnie didn't wait for an answer. He started walking toward him, cane tapping rhythmically, every limp a history lesson. Hal followed behind, then another vet, and another, until a line had quietly formed, 4, 5, 6 of them. Men and women who had once marched under sun and fire, who knew what leadership smelled like and what cowardice tried to hide behind. "We were just wondering," Ronnie said, stopping near the photo board, "why there's no picture of the highest-ranking officer in this damn yard." Frank didn't respond right away. Aunt Diane stepped in instead, trying to diffuse what she sensed could become a moment. "We only had room for a few," she said quickly. "Didn't want to crowd the display. It's tradition." Ronnie looked at her like she'd spoken in tongues. "Tradition?" he repeated. "Hell, I remember a time when the only tradition worth keeping was honoring the ones who bled for your right to have one." Frank finally stepped forward. His voice was low, but it carried. "I told them not to put it up." Rebecca didn't blink, not when the words landed. Not when the others turned to look at him. She stood quietly, brushed the grass off her slacks, and walked over. "No need to protect them," she said. "You all made that choice together." Frank's eyes met hers. Something in him had shifted. No longer the hard edge of stubbornness, but something else. Hesitation, exposure. I didn't know how to explain it, he said. You coming back, after all that. You didn't have to explain anything, Rebecca replied. You just had to admit I deserved to be there. Frank stared at the photo board. I don't have a photo, he said. Not one in uniform, anyway. James, who had appeared quietly beside them, pulled his phone from his pocket. I do, he said. From Kandahar. I got it from a friend of hers. He tapped the screen, showed it to Frank. In the image, Rebecca stood with her unit under a makeshift sunshade. Boots thick with dust, helmet clipped to her side, eyes focused and alive. Not posed, not polished, just real. Frank looked at it for a long time. Send it to me, he said. James nodded. Already did. Rebecca let the moment settle. She wasn't going to thank him. Not yet, maybe not ever. But when Frank stepped forward, took a thumbtack from the corner of the board, and pinned the image dead center, that was enough. No applause, no ceremony, just a photo and a father finally making room for his daughter. And that night, long after the yard had emptied and the folding chairs were stacked by the fence, Rebecca stood alone in the dim porch light, staring at the board. For the first time, her face stared back. The photo stayed up. It wasn't taken down when the folding tables were carried back to the garage or when the bunting came off the poles and was rolled up into a box that still smelled faintly of mothballs. It wasn't tucked away or lost beneath the faded newsprint and sepia photographs of long-ago campaigns. It stayed there, pinned dead center just as Frank Sievers had placed it, held by two rusted tacks and something far heavier, a quiet apology that didn't need words to be understood. Rebecca returned the next morning, not because she had to, but because something in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time, tugged her back. The yard was empty now, save for a few chairs still leaning against the fence, and a trash bag someone had forgotten near the grill. The breeze smelled cleaner. The sunlight was softer. There was no performance left, no eyes watching her movements, no silence daring her to speak. She walked straight to the board. The picture was still there, no creases, no coffee stains, no attempts to cover it with another frame. She stared at it for a long time. The uniform, the dirt, the men and women beside her. Some gone, some still waking up every morning to fight battles no one saw. She wasn't smiling in the photo. She was present, focused, alive, and now visible behind her. The screen door creaked open again. Frank's steps were slower than usual, the sound of boots over porch wood a little more hesitant. I left it up, he said simply. Rebecca didn't turn. I see that. He stopped beside her. Not too close, just enough. I wasn't sure if you'd want it there. I do, she said. But not for me. Frank looked over. Then who? For her, Rebecca answered, tapping the image gently. The girl in that photo. The one you tried to forget. The one who kept standing even after everything fell down around her. Frank's hands went into his pockets. It wasn't nervousness, it was habit. I didn't know how to reach her. You didn't try, she said, gently but firmly. He didn't argue. I'm not here to punish you, she added after a pause. That's never been what I wanted. I just needed you to see me, all of me. Frank nodded, a single, slow dip of his head. I see you now. They stood like that for a while, shoulder to shoulder but still separated by all the things that hadn't been said over the years. Then something shifted. Something subtle, like the final click of a long-jammed mechanism unlocking. I told Ronnie I wanted to take something to the VFW, Frank said. They're making a new wall, one that includes post 9/11. Thought your photo should be there. Rebecca turned this time, her brow raised slightly. That's so, he gave the ghost of a grin. You earned more than a place on the backyard fence. The words came out rough, like sandpaper over gravel, but they landed. I'd like that, she said. Thank you. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in an old handkerchief. He opened it slowly, revealing the tarnished Marine Corps challenge coin he'd carried since the day he retired. The edges were smooth from decades of wear. "I don't hand this out," he said. "Never have. Not even to James." Rebecca stared at it. Frank hesitated. "But I should have given it to you a long time ago." She took it, her fingers closing gently around the coin. It was warm from his pocket, solid, heavy in the way things with meaning always are. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Rebecca glanced toward the house. "You still make that awful drip coffee?" Frank chuckled, low and short. "Some things don't change." She started walking toward the porch. "Good. I'll make us a real pot." He followed her inside. The kitchen smelled like lemon cleaner and toast. Marilyn was already there, stacking dishes, with the radio humming softly in the background. She looked up, surprise flickering across her face, then something gentler. Not quite relief, more like recognition. "Morning," she said. "Morning," Rebecca echoed. They stood across from one another for a beat. The same kitchen where Marilyn used to place lunchboxes by the door, and where Rebecca had once been scolded for tracking in mud after football practice. "I was just making eggs," Marilyn offered. "You hungry?" "I am," Rebecca said. "Actually," James showed up 20 minutes later, still half in uniform, still brushing crumbs off his tie. He paused in the doorway, like he wasn't sure he'd stepped into the right dimension. His sister at the table, their parents quietly moving around each other, the tension replaced with something workable. He grinned. "This looks dangerously close to normal," Rebecca smirked. "Don't push your luck." They sat together, the four of them, over eggs and toast and good coffee. Not every word spoken carried weight. Some were light, some were nonsense, but all of them were real. After breakfast, Rebecca stepped out back one more time. The sun was higher now, the day warmer. Across the fence, a few kids rode by on bikes, their laughter trailing behind them like ribbons. Rebecca reached into her bag and pulled out a wooden photo frame she'd brought from the lodge. No gold, no glass, just plain oak, sanded smooth. She unpinned the photo from the board, slipped it carefully into the frame and hung it back in the same spot. This time, it didn't look temporary. It looked like it belonged. Aunt Diane appeared out of nowhere, as she always did, holding a Tupperware container and adjusting her cardigan like she'd just come from church. She looked at the photo, then at Rebecca. "Well," she said, pursing her lips. "Took long enough." Rebecca didn't respond. She didn't need to. Later that afternoon, she stood in front of the old community center downtown, where the Veterans Hall sat tucked between the library and the fire station. Hal and Ronnie were already inside, and someone had hung a sign above the entrance, "Honoring Our Own." She walked in quietly. On the main wall, framed in a new row of portraits, was the photo from Kandahar. This time, there was a nameplate underneath. Brigadier General Rebecca Sievers, U.S. Army, Service 2002-2016, Valor. Leadership. Sacrifice. She stood in front of it for a long while, not because she needed to see it again, but because she knew someone else eventually would. And when they did, they wouldn't just see a soldier. They'd see a woman who had come back from silence, from judgment, from invisibility, and claimed her place not with noise, but with truth. Outside, the wind carried the sound of the town going on. Inside, for the first time in a long time, Rebecca felt still. She belonged, and this time, no one could take that away.